I'm Sergeant Samantha Barrett, 26 years old, and I built my career training America's elite soldiers in urban warfare. For years, I pushed myself harder than anyone, 3 deployments prepped, 2 commendations, countless hours on the range, because I thought if I gave everything, my father would finally be proud. But when he stood at a veterans hall, laughed, and told a room full of men I was just a girl playing soldier, something in me changed forever. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you trusted most? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you exactly what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being torn down, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What came next? Even I didn't see coming. The first time Dad called my service, pretend soldiering, I was 26 and home for Thanksgiving. He'd been drinking since noon, telling his same war stories to my Uncle Billy when I mentioned getting promoted to staff sergeant. "That's cute, honey," he said, not looking up from his beer. "Playing dress-up with the other girls." I should have seen it coming. Dad never outright dismissed my career, but the little comments had been building for months. When I'd call home from base, he'd ask if I was still playing Army. When I showed him photos from training exercises, he'd nod politely and change the subject to his own deployment stories from the Gulf War. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. It was how he lit up when he talked about real soldiers. Men like Tommy Reeves, his old Navy SEAL buddy from way back. Tommy had saved Dad's unit during a reconnaissance mission in '91, and Dad never let anyone forget it. Whenever Tommy's name came up, Dad's whole demeanor changed. His shoulders squared, his voice carried weight, like he was borrowing some of Tommy's legend for himself. "Now that's what a warrior looks like," he'd say, showing people the photo of him and Tommy in desert fatigues. 18 confirmed kills, 3 Bronze Stars. A real American hero. I'd heard the story 100 times. How Tommy had single-handedly held off insurgents while Dad's convoy regrouped. How he carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. How he'd earned the respect of every man in their unit. "Don't embarrass me in front of the real men," Dad told me quietly before Tommy's first visit to our house last Christmas. I was in full dress uniform, having just returned from a ceremony at Fort Carson, but somehow I felt smaller than ever. Tommy was everything Dad said he'd be. Quiet confidence, steel gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in a room. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but not showy. He asked respectful questions about my service, listened to my answers, treated me like any other soldier. But I could see Dad watching us, waiting for Tommy to confirm what he already believed, that my service was somehow lesser. The dynamic became clearer over the next few months. At family barbecues, Dad would steer conversations toward military topics whenever Tommy was around. He'd share stories about real combat, about the weight of making life-or-death decisions, about brotherhood forged under fire. All while glancing at me with this look that said I wouldn't understand. "Samantha's never seen actual combat," he'd tell people, like it was my fault. Like I hadn't volunteered for 3 deployments that got canceled due to bureaucratic shuffling. Like I hadn't spent 2 years training Rangers and Special Forces candidates in urban warfare tactics. The comments got sharper. When I mentioned advanced training courses, he'd wave them off. "They probably go easy on the girls." When I talked about leading training exercises, he'd say, "That's different from the real thing." When other family members praised my service, he'd smile tightly and change the subject to Tommy's latest adventure. Tommy seemed uncomfortable with the comparisons, but he never contradicted Dad directly. Instead, he'd ask me thoughtful questions about my work, about the soldiers I'd trained, about the challenges facing the modern military. His respect felt genuine, which made Dad's dismissal sting even more. The breaking point came when Dad announced that Tommy would be joining us at the Veterans Day dinner downtown. The local VFW was hosting their annual gathering, and Dad had been talking about it for weeks. It would be his chance to introduce Tommy to real veterans, to bask in reflected glory among men who would understand what true service looked like. "You're welcome to come too, I suppose," he told me the week before the event. "Just don't expect anyone to be impressed by your little career." I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting through another evening of Dad's stories, of watching him parade Tommy around while treating me like his embarrassing civilian daughter, made my stomach turn. But something stubborn in me refused to back down. I'd earned my place at that table just as much as anyone else. The night of the dinner, I wore my dress uniform with full decorations. Dad frowned when he saw me. "Isn't that a little much?" he asked. Tommy, standing beside him in a simple suit, looked me over and nodded approvingly. "You look sharp, Sergeant." Dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything else. The VFW hall was packed with veterans from every era. World War II survivors in their 80s, Vietnam vets with graying ponytails, younger guys from Iraq and Afghanistan who looked like they were still processing what they'd seen. The air thick with cigarette smoke and old stories, the kind of place where respect was earned through shared sacrifice. Dad worked the room like a politician, introducing Tommy to everyone who'd listen. "This is Tommy Reeves," he'd say, his chest puffing out. "Navy SEAL. Real warrior. Saved my unit back in the Gulf." Tommy handled the attention gracefully, but I could see him growing uncomfortable with Dad's showmanship. He tried to deflect praise, to steer conversations toward other people's service, but Dad kept pulling focus back to him. I found myself standing alone near the bar, nursing a Coke and watching the performance. A few veterans came up to chat, asking about my service with genuine interest. But every time Dad caught sight of these conversations, he'd appear with Tommy in tow, ready to redirect attention to what real heroism looked like. The setup was perfect for what came next. Dad had cornered a group of older veterans, men who commanded respect in this room, and was holding court with Tommy as his prize exhibit. I was close enough to hear, far enough away to feel invisible. That's when everything changed. The words came out of Dad's mouth like he'd been saving them for months. "She's just a girl playing soldier." His voice carried across the room, cutting through conversations and turning heads. He gestured toward Tommy with a sweep of his beer bottle. "This is real courage." The room went quiet. Not the respectful quiet of people paying attention to a good story, but the uncomfortable silence that follows a social mistake. Several veterans glanced in my direction, their faces showing embarrassment for me, anger at Dad, confusion about why a father would humiliate his daughter in public. I felt my face burn. 20 years of service, 3 commendations, countless hours training the soldiers who'd go on to serve with distinction, and this was how my own father chose to define me. In front of the people whose respect I'd spent my career earning. Tommy's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went white, not with embarrassment, but with something approaching shock. He stared at me like he was seeing a ghost, his mouth slightly open, his beer forgotten in his hand. "My God," he whispered, barely audible but somehow carrying in the sudden silence. "The Widowmaker of Fallujah." The words hit the room like a physical force. Conversations stopped completely. Veterans who'd been laughing moments before turned to stare. Even the bartender looked up from the glasses he'd been cleaning. Dad's smile faltered. "What did you say?" Tommy couldn't take his eyes off me. His voice was stronger now, filled with something that sounded like awe. "You're her. The sniper who held off 3 platoons of insurgents during the siege. The one who saved 2nd Battalion when they were pinned down in the Market District." I'd never told Dad about Fallujah. It wasn't the kind of story you shared at family dinners, wasn't the kind of mission that translated well to civilian conversation. The classified details, the political complications, the weight of the decisions I'd made in those 48 hours, none of it seemed appropriate for holiday gatherings. But Tommy knew. Somehow, this man who Dad had held up as the standard of real heroism knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. 37 confirmed kills over 2 days, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. "You held that position for 18 hours straight while calling in air support and coordinating ground movements. Half the guys in that battalion owe their lives to you." The room was dead silent now. Dad looked between Tommy and me, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. The veterans around us were leaning closer, hanging on every word. "The brass wanted to give you the Medal of Honor," Tommy said. "But the mission was too classified, too politically sensitive." So they buried your service record and gave you a commendation that didn't even hint at what you'd actually done. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I'd intended. How do you know about that? Tommy's smile was grim. Because I was the SEAL team leader who extracted you from that rooftop. I'm the one who carried you out when you finally collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. The room erupted. Veterans were standing now, some reaching out to shake my hand, others just staring with newfound respect. The older men who'd served in Korea and Vietnam were nodding knowingly. They understood what it meant to have your service hidden, your sacrifices minimized by politics and classification. Dad stood frozen in the middle of it all, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The man he'd held up as the ultimate warrior was publicly honoring the daughter he'd just humiliated. The real veterans he'd wanted to impress were surrounding me, not him. "Sir," one of the Vietnam vets said to Dad, his voice cold. "You just insulted one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced." Tommy was still staring at me, shaking his head in disbelief. "I always wondered what happened to you after that mission. You disappeared from the active roster, and nobody would talk about the Widowmaker. I figured you'd been killed or medically discharged." "I requested a transfer to Training Command," I said quietly. "I didn't want to do that kind of work anymore." Tommy nodded, understanding. 2 days in hell will do that to a person. But what you did out there? He turned to address the room, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a legend. "This woman is why 50 American soldiers made it home to their families. She's the reason mothers still have sons, wives still have husbands." The applause started slowly, with one old Marine clapping his weathered hands together. Then others joined in until the entire room was on its feet, applauding a service they'd known nothing about 5 minutes earlier. Dad tried to salvage something from the moment. "I had no idea," he said weakly. "Samantha never told me about any of this." But the damage was done. The room had seen his true character, had witnessed him publicly dismissing a hero. The respect he'd tried to borrow from Tommy's reputation had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that he'd revealed more about himself than about his daughter. Growing up, I measured my worth by the distance between Dad's expectations and my achievements. He'd tell stories about his Gulf War deployment every chance he got. Nothing dramatic, just standard convoy security and supply runs, but he made them sound like scenes from a war movie. I'd sit cross-legged on the living room carpet, hanging on every word, dreaming of the day I'd have stories that would make him proud. When I told him at 17 that I wanted to enlist, his reaction surprised me. Not pride or encouragement, but a kind of skeptical amusement. "The Army's different now than when I served," he said. "They've gone soft. All this sensitivity training and political correctness. Nothing like the real military I knew." I thought he was testing me, seeing if I was serious enough to push back against his doubts. So I researched everything: fitness requirements, military occupational specialties, leadership development programs. I showed him articles about modern warfare, about the technical skills required for contemporary soldiers, about the increasing complexity of military operations. He listened politely, but I could see him checking out whenever I got too detailed. It was like he'd already decided that whatever I did would be a watered-down version of real service. Basic training was the first time I'd ever been away from home for more than a week. I wrote letters every few days, describing the challenges, the camaraderie, the satisfaction of mastering new skills. Dad's responses were brief and generic: "Glad you're doing well, stay safe, love, Dad." No questions about my training, no interest in what I was learning. When I graduated, he and Mom came to the ceremony. I watched him during the parade, hoping to see some recognition in his face of what I'd accomplished. Instead, he spent most of the time talking to other parents about his own service, using my graduation as a conversation starter about his deployment. "It's good they're giving kids like Samantha a chance to serve," I overheard him tell another father. "Even if it's not the same kind of challenge we faced." The pattern continued through my first assignments. I'd call home with updates about advanced training courses, leadership positions, commendations for excellence in marksmanship and tactical operations. Dad would listen politely and change the subject to his own experiences or to stories about Tommy Reeves that he'd heard through their veteran network. Tommy's consulting for some private security firm now, he'd say. Making serious money. Real operators are in high demand. The implication was clear. If I was doing important work, there would be more obvious rewards, more public recognition. The classified nature of much of my service made it impossible to explain why my achievements stayed buried in personnel files instead of making headlines. My first deployment got canceled 3 days before we were supposed to ship out. Political complications, they told us. The mission parameters had changed, and suddenly they needed a different kind of team. I spent 6 months training for urban warfare operations that never happened. When I called Dad to tell him, I could hear the disappointment in his voice. Not disappointment that I wouldn't get to serve, but confirmation that the modern military was all preparation and no action. In my day, when they said you were deploying, you deployed, he said. None of this bureaucratic flip-flopping. The second cancellation hurt worse. We'd made it all the way to Kuwait before getting orders to return stateside. Budget cuts, they said. Congressional oversight. The kind of political maneuvering that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with election cycles. Dad's reaction was predictable. Maybe you should consider a transfer to a support role, he suggested. Logistics or administration. Something more stable. I couldn't explain to him that I'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments available, that I'd specifically requested placement with units that were guaranteed to see combat. The selection process was so competitive that making it to final training was an achievement in itself. But since none of it resulted in deployment, none of it counted in Dad's accounting system. When I finally did get deployed, not to Iraq or Afghanistan, but to a classified operation that I still can't discuss in detail, Dad seemed almost relieved that he wouldn't have to worry about me. Sounds like administrative work, he said when I gave him the carefully edited version of my assignment. If only he'd known. The 48 hours in Fallujah tested everything I'd learned in 8 years of service. Urban warfare in its purest, most brutal form. Decisions that had to be made in seconds, with incomplete information and American lives hanging in the balance. I'd been positioned on an abandoned building's roof, providing overwatch for a battalion that was trying to extract civilians from a market district that had become a kill zone. Intelligence had indicated minimal resistance, but the situation deteriorated rapidly once our guys were committed. 3 separate insurgent forces had converged on the market, turning what should have been a simple evacuation into a coordinated ambush. The battalion was pinned down, taking casualties, with no clear route of retreat. That's when the radio chatter started mentioning the sniper. Someone with exceptional position and clear fields of fire, someone who could provide cover for the trapped soldiers. The battalion commander was requesting immediate support, and somehow I was the closest asset available. For 2 days, I held that rooftop. 37 confirmed kills, each one a calculated decision to preserve American lives. I called in airstrikes, coordinated ground movements, provided intelligence updates based on enemy positions I could see from my elevated position. By the end, I was running on muscle memory and training instincts. Blood loss from shrapnel wounds, dehydration, exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. When Tommy's SEAL team finally reached my position, I was barely conscious. The extraction was classified immediately. The political implications of American operations in that sector were too complex, too sensitive for public discussion. My service record was scrubbed, my commendation was generic, and the men whose lives I'd saved were instructed not to discuss the details of their rescue. I never told Dad about any of it. How could I explain that his daughter had spent 48 hours as the most lethal American soldier in a combat zone? How could I describe the weight of taking 37 lives to save 50 others? How could I make him understand that the administrative work he dismissed had actually been the defining moment of my military career? Instead, I requested a transfer to training command. I wanted to teach urban warfare tactics, to pass on what I'd learned to soldiers who might face similar situations. It was important work, necessary work, but it didn't make for exciting dinner conversation. Dad never asked why I'd changed assignments. He seemed content to assume I'd found my proper place in the military hierarchy, somewhere safe and predictable where his little girl could play soldier without getting into real trouble. The irony was devastating. I'd built my entire career trying to earn his respect, to prove that I could measure up to his standard of what a soldier should be. And the one mission that would have made him proud, the one mission that justified every moment of training, every sacrifice, every challenge I'd overcome, had to stay secret. The weeks after the Veterans Day dinner passed in a haze of replayed conversations and sleepless nights. I kept hearing Dad's voice, "She's just a girl playing soldier." The words had taken on their own life, echoing every time I closed my eyes, every time someone mentioned military service, every time I looked in the mirror while getting ready for work. Tommy had given me something I'd never expected: public recognition from a genuine hero, validation from someone whose opinion carried real weight in the veteran community. But it couldn't erase the fundamental truth that had been exposed that night. My own father had been willing to humiliate me in front of people whose respect I valued most. The phone calls started 3 days later. Veterans I'd never met, calling to thank me for my service, to tell me they'd heard about what happened at the VFW. Word had spread through the tight-knit community of older soldiers, the ones who understood what classified missions really meant and why some stories never get told. My grandson's in the Rangers now, one World War II veteran told me. "I'm going to tell him about you. About what real service looks like." Each call was meant to be supportive, but they had the opposite effect. These men were giving me the honor and recognition that my own father had refused to provide. Their pride in my service only highlighted how completely Dad had failed to understand who I'd become. At work, my colleagues were careful not to mention the incident directly, but I could see them watching me differently. Word had gotten around the base. It always does in military communities. People who'd known me for years were suddenly seeing me through a different lens, wondering what other classified operations I'd been involved in, what other stories I couldn't tell. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anyone, right?" Captain Martinez told me during a routine training briefing. "Especially not to family members who don't understand what we do." I appreciated the sentiment, but it missed the point entirely. This wasn't about proving anything to Dad anymore. It was about the 20-year-old girl who'd joined the Army to make him proud, who'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments available, who'd risked everything for a moment of recognition that would never come. The hardest part was the missed opportunities. All those family gatherings where I'd sat quietly while Dad held court with his war stories. All those times he'd introduced Tommy as his idea of a real warrior, never knowing that the real warrior was sitting across the dinner table, saying nothing. I started reviewing my service record, pulling files I hadn't looked at in years. Commendations, performance evaluations, training certifications, letters of recommendation from commanding officers. The paper trail of a distinguished career, of a soldier who'd exceeded every expectation and earned the respect of everyone she'd served with. Except the one person whose opinion had mattered most. The photos were harder to look at. Images from training exercises, graduation ceremonies, promotion celebrations. In almost every picture, I was smiling like someone who believed her achievements were building toward something meaningful. Someone who thought hard work and dedication would eventually translate into recognition from the people she loved. There was one photo from my basic training graduation that I'd forgotten about. Dad and Mom standing with me in full dress uniform, all three of us squinting into the sun. I was beaming with pride, finally wearing the uniform I'd dreamed about since childhood. Dad looked uncomfortable, like he was posing for someone else's achievement. I'd carried that photo with me through every deployment, every assignment, every difficult moment when I needed a reminder of why I was serving. Looking at it now, I could see what I'd been too naive to recognize at 20. Dad had already made up his mind about what my service would mean to him. My phone rang constantly those first few weeks. Fellow soldiers, veterans from other eras, even some family members who'd heard about the incident secondhand. Everyone wanted to express their support, to tell me how proud they were, to ask why I'd never mentioned my combat experience. Because it was classified, I'd explain over and over. Because the mission details were too sensitive for public discussion. Because I was ordered not to talk about it. What I couldn't explain was the deeper reason, because I'd been protecting Dad's feelings. Because I'd known that the truth about my service would force him to confront his own assumptions about what real warfare looked like. because I'd been more concerned with preserving his dignity than with claiming the recognition I'd earned. The irony was crushing. All those years of letting him minimize my achievements, of sitting quietly while he praised other soldiers, of allowing him to treat my career as a hobby, I'd done it to protect him from the truth about what his daughter had become. But the protection had been one-sided. When the moment came to choose between supporting me and maintaining his own narrative, Dad had chosen himself. He'd thrown me under the bus in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to me, just to make a point about Tommy's superiority. 3 weeks after the dinner, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and revolutionary. I was done seeking his approval. Done measuring my achievements against his expectations. Done protecting his feelings at the expense of my own dignity. The realization didn't come with anger or dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, more like a door closing than a bridge burning. I simply stopped caring whether Dad understood the significance of my service. His opinion no longer held the power to validate or diminish what I'd accomplished. But understanding that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different processes entirely. Late at night, when the base was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I still felt the sting of his betrayal. Still wondered what I could have done differently, how I could have earned the recognition that seemed to come so easily for other soldiers. The answer, I was beginning to understand, was that I couldn't have done anything differently. The problem wasn't with my service or my achievements. The problem was with a father who'd been so invested in his own version of military heroism that he couldn't recognize it when it was sitting at his dinner table. The next family gathering was my cousin Jenny's wedding reception, 6 weeks after the Veterans Day dinner. I almost didn't go. The thought of facing Dad in front of extended family, of pretending everything was normal while the memory of his betrayal was still fresh, made my stomach clench every time I thought about it. But avoiding family events would have felt like giving him another victory, letting his cruelty drive me away from people I cared about. So I bought a dress, practiced my smile in the mirror, and prepared for what would probably be an uncomfortable evening. Dad was waiting for me when I walked into the reception hall, drink already in hand despite the early hour. His smile looked forced, like someone had coached him on how to appear normal around his estranged daughter. "Samantha," he said, reaching out like he was going to hug me. "You look nice." I stepped back slightly, just enough to avoid the embrace without making a scene. "Thanks. Congratulations on Jenny's wedding." The conversation died there. We both knew what had happened at the VFW, both knew that something fundamental had changed between us, but neither of us was willing to address it directly in a public setting. Instead, Dad tried his usual approach, steering the conversation toward military topics where he could control the narrative. But something was different now. When he started telling his Gulf War stories to a group of relatives, people listened politely but without the enthusiasm they'd shown in the past. His humiliation of me had cost him credibility, made people question his judgment and character. "Tell us about Samantha's service," Aunt Linda suggested during one of his monologues. "We never hear much about what she did in the Army." Dad's face tightened. "Samantha can speak for herself if she wants to share." But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I smiled and changed the subject to Jenny's honeymoon plans. Let Dad wonder if I was protecting classified information or simply choosing not to give him ammunition for another attack. The dynamic shift was subtle but unmistakable. Family members who used to hang on Dad's war stories were asking me direct questions about military life. Cousins I hadn't talked to in years were approaching me with genuine curiosity about my experiences. The respect that Dad had been trying to command was flowing toward me instead. He noticed. I could see him watching these interactions, his jaw tightening every time someone praised my service or asked about my career. The attention he'd taken for granted was being redirected, and he didn't know how to reclaim it. "I heard what happened at the Veterans Day dinner," my Uncle Billy told me quietly during the cocktail hour. "Your dad was out of line. Way out of line." Word had spread through the family network, as it always does. People who'd witnessed Dad's pattern of dismissing my achievements were reframing those moments in light of what Tommy had revealed. The little comments, the subtle put-downs, the constant comparisons to other soldiers, they all looked different now. "Dad just doesn't understand modern military operations," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. It's a generational thing. Uncle Billy shook his head. It's not generational, Samantha. It's personal. He's been jealous of your success for years, and it finally showed. The conversation ended when Dad approached our corner of the room, but the damage was done. Family members were talking about his behavior, questioning his motives, seeing through the facade of paternal concern to the petty jealousy underneath. When Tommy arrived with his wife an hour into the reception, the atmosphere shifted again. Dad's whole posture changed, his chest puffing out as he prepared to bask in reflected glory. But Tommy barely acknowledged him, making a direct line to where I was standing near the bar. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, his concern genuine. "I'm fine," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. "Thank you for what you said that night. I know it put you in an awkward position." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "The only awkward position was watching your father humiliate someone I consider a genuine American hero. I should have said something years ago when I first figured out who you were." Dad appeared beside us, his smile brittle. "Tommy, great to see you. How's the consulting business?" Tommy's response was polite but cool. "Fine. I was just telling Samantha how much I respect her service record." The conversation was stilted, loaded with undercurrents that Dad couldn't navigate. Tommy's respect for me was obvious and unshakable, but his relationship with Dad had been permanently damaged by witnessing his cruelty. The easy camaraderie they'd shared was gone, replaced by formal politeness that everyone could feel. As the evening progressed, I found myself in a strange position. Family members were treating me with new respect, veterans at the reception were seeking me out for conversation, and even strangers seemed to sense that I was someone worth knowing. The recognition I'd craved for 20 years was finally coming, but not because of anything I'd done recently. Dad watched it all happen from the sidelines, his influence diminished, his stories falling flat. When he tried to interject his own experiences into conversations about my service, people listened politely and then turned back to me for details he couldn't provide. "I'm proud of you," my cousin Samantha told me as the reception was winding down. "I always knew there was more to your story than Dad let on." The comment hit me unexpectedly hard. These people had always suspected that Dad was minimizing my achievements, but they'd never called him on it directly. My humiliation at the VFW had given them permission to say what they'd been thinking for years. As I was leaving, Dad caught up with me in the parking lot. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he'd done and try to repair some of the damage. Instead, he said, "I'm still your father, Samantha. You owe me some respect." I looked at him standing there in his rumpled suit, slightly drunk and completely unaware of how thoroughly he'd revealed his own character. The man I'd spent my entire adult life trying to impress, trying to make proud, trying to earn recognition from. "Respect is earned," I said quietly. "You taught me that." Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot with nobody left to impress. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Recognition, when it finally comes after years of being overlooked, creates its own set of challenges. I'd spent so long operating in Dad's shadow, measuring my worth by his impossible standards, that stepping into my own light felt disorienting at first. The calls from younger soldiers started a few weeks after Jenny's wedding. Word had spread through military networks about the Widowmaker of Fallujah, about the classified mission that had saved an entire battalion. Soldiers wanted advice about urban warfare tactics, about handling pressure in combat situations, about building the mental discipline required for precision shooting under extreme conditions. "Ma'am, I heard you held a position for 48 hours straight during the siege," a young corporal told me during a training session. "How do you maintain focus for that long when everything's falling apart around you?" These were the conversations I'd always wanted to have about my service. Technical discussions about methodology, philosophical questions about decision-making under pressure, practical advice about managing fear and maintaining situational awareness. The kind of military talk that Dad had always redirected toward his own experiences or Tommy's achievements. My commanding officer, Colonel Richards, called me into his office on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd been expecting a routine performance review, but his expression suggested something more significant. "I've been getting inquiries about you," he said without preamble. "Pentagon-level inquiries." People want to know if you'd be interested in a consulting position, working with special operations units on urban warfare training. The opportunity was unprecedented. A chance to develop curriculum based on real combat experience, to train the next generation of soldiers who might face similar situations to what I'd survived in Fallujah. It was recognition at the highest levels of military leadership, the kind of career advancement I dreamed about for years. There's one complication, Colonel Richards continued. The position would require declassifying portions of your service record, making your Fallujah operation part of the public discussion about modern warfare tactics. The decision felt loaded with symbolism. For 20 years, I'd kept quiet about my most significant achievement to protect Dad's feelings, to avoid forcing him to confront the reality of what his daughter had become. Now I was being asked to step fully into the light, to claim my place among the soldiers whose stories get told. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. The change in how people treated me was immediate and profound. Military personnel who'd known me for years started showing different levels of respect. Training sessions became more focused, more intense, as soldiers realized they were learning from someone who'd actually used these tactics in life-or-death situations. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in my adult life, I was defining my own worth rather than letting Dad's opinions determine my value. His approval or disapproval had become irrelevant to my sense of professional identity. Dad seemed to sense the shift. At Mom's birthday party in April, he made several attempts to re-establish his position as the family's military expert, but they fell flat. When he started telling his Gulf War convoy stories, people listened politely and then asked me about modern combat operations. When he mentioned Tommy's achievements, someone inevitably brought up my own classified mission. "Samantha's doing consulting work for the Pentagon now," Mom told the assembled relatives with obvious pride. "Teaching special operations soldiers about urban warfare." Dad's smile looked like it caused him physical pain. "That's nice," he managed. The moment that defined everything came when my teenage nephew asked me directly about the Fallujah mission. "Uncle Dave says you saved a whole bunch of soldiers," he said. "Is that true?" I glanced at Dad, giving him one last chance to participate in the conversation as a supportive father rather than a competitor. But his expression was closed off, defensive, preparing for another round of comparisons that he knew he'd lose. "It was a team effort," I said carefully. "But yes, we managed to get everyone home safely." "How many bad guys did you get?" my nephew pressed, clearly fascinated by the idea of his aunt as an action hero. "Enough," I said simply. Later, as the party was winding down, Tommy and his wife stopped by to say goodbye. The dynamic between Tommy and Dad had never recovered from the Veterans Day incident, but Tommy made an effort to be polite for Mom's sake. "Samantha, I wanted you to know that some of the guys from 2nd Battalion have been asking about you," Tommy said. "They're having a reunion next month. They'd like you to come." The invitation was significant. A chance to reconnect with soldiers whose lives I'd helped save, to finally be acknowledged by the people who understood the true cost of that 48-hour mission. It was closure I hadn't realized I needed. Dad overheard the conversation. "That sounds nice," he said stiffly. "I'm sure Samantha would enjoy seeing her old friends." Tommy's response was carefully neutral. "It's not about friendship. It's about honoring someone who made the ultimate sacrifice for her brothers in arms. These men owe their lives to her." The room went quiet. Tommy had drawn a clear line between social recognition and earned respect, between casual acknowledgement and the kind of honor reserved for genuine heroes. Everyone understood the implication. Dad's dismissal of my service hadn't just been wrong, it had been a betrayal of military values he claimed to hold sacred. That night, after everyone had left, I helped Mom clean up while Dad sat in his recliner, unusually quiet. As I was getting ready to leave, he called out to me from the living room. "Samantha," he said, his voice smaller than usual. "Can we talk?" I paused at the front door, my hand on the knob. This was the moment I'd been waiting for since the Veterans Day dinner, a chance for him to acknowledge what he'd done, to apologize for years of dismissal and humiliation. But I'd learned not to expect too much from these conversations. "What about?" I asked, not moving from the doorway. "I've been thinking about what happened at the VFW," he said slowly. About what Tommy said. About things I didn't know. He was struggling with the words, clearly uncomfortable with admitting ignorance about anything military-related. But there was something different in his tone, a hesitancy I'd never heard before. I had no idea about your mission, he continued. About what you did over there. Why didn't you ever tell me? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 20 years of missed opportunities and deliberate silence. How could I explain that I'd been protecting his feelings? That I'd known the truth about my service would force him to confront his own assumptions about military heroism? It was classified, I said finally. And you made it clear that you weren't interested in hearing about my real experiences. Dad winced like I'd slapped him. That's not true. I've always been proud of your service. No, I said quietly. You've been proud of the idea of my service. The sanitized version that didn't threaten your position as the family's military expert. We stared at each other across the living room, the weight of 2 decades of unspoken resentment settling between us. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, diminished by the recognition that he'd fundamentally misunderstood his own daughter. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. I don't know if you can, I replied. But you could start by not trying to minimize what other people have accomplished just to make yourself feel important. I left him sitting there, staring at the wall where his military photos hung in neat rows. Photos of convoy runs and supply missions, important work, but nothing that compared to the classified operations he'd spent years dismissing as pretend soldiering. The conversation felt like an ending rather than a beginning. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined, but a quiet acknowledgement that some damage can't be repaired through late-night apologies and awkward admissions of ignorance. The 2nd Battalion reunion took place at a hotel conference room outside Fort Bragg on a humid Saturday in May. I debated whether to attend for weeks, uncertain about reopening old wounds and revisiting memories I'd spent years trying to process. But walking into that room felt like coming home in a way I hadn't expected. 43 men who'd survived the Fallujah siege, many of whom I hadn't seen since our extraction 20 years earlier. They stood when I entered, not because of military protocol, but because of genuine respect for what we'd shared during those 48 hours. Holy shit, Sergeant Martinez said, grinning as he pulled me into a bear hug. The Widowmaker herself. I was starting to think you were a ghost story. The nickname still felt strange coming from people who'd actually been there, who understood what it represented. Not glorification of violence, but recognition of precision under impossible pressure. The ability to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between soldiers coming home and families receiving folded flags. We've been trying to track you down for years, Captain Williams told me. Nobody would tell us what happened to you after the extraction. Security protocols, they said. I spent the next hour catching up with men who'd moved on to civilian careers, to other military assignments, to lives shaped by those 2 days in ways they were still discovering. We talked about the market district, about the coordination required to evacuate civilians while under fire, about the weight of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared with people back home. You know what I remember most? Corporal Jackson said during the formal dinner portion of the evening. Not the firefights or the casualties or even how scared we were. I remember your voice on the radio, calm as anything, calling out enemy positions and coordinating air support like you were reading a grocery list. Several men nodded agreement. They shared stories I'd forgotten, moments when my radio updates had prevented ambushes or my covering fire had allowed wounded soldiers to reach safety. Memories that had been classified for so long that even I had started to minimize their significance. Tommy was there too, along with the rest of his SEAL team that had handled our extraction. Seeing them together brought back the final hours of the mission, exhaustion so complete that I'd barely been conscious when they reached my position, blood loss from shrapnel wounds that had gone untreated for 36 hours. I've been to a lot of reunions, Tommy told the assembled group during his speech. I've served with some of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. But what happened in Fallujah was something special. 43 men came home because one person refused to abandon her position. The applause felt different from what I'd experienced at family gatherings or military ceremonies. These men understood the technical challenges of what I'd accomplished, the psychological pressure of making life-or-death decisions for 2 straight days. Their recognition came from shared experience rather than abstract respect for military service. During the social hour afterward, Captain Williams pulled me aside for a private conversation. "We've been talking about putting together a formal recommendation," he said, "declassifying enough of the mission details to justify a proper commendation. Maybe even pushing for the Medal of Honor that should have been awarded originally." The suggestion was flattering, but felt unnecessary. Recognition from these men, from soldiers who'd been there and understood what had actually happened, meant more than any official decoration ever could. "I'm not sure I want that kind of attention," I said honestly. Williams nodded understanding. "We figured you might say that. But we wanted you to know that the option exists. That there are people in high places who remember what you did and think it deserves proper acknowledgement." As the evening wound down, I found myself in conversation with Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who'd been one of the wounded soldiers I'd provided cover for during the evacuation. He'd taken shrapnel to both legs, but had managed to reach safety while I kept insurgent forces pinned down. "My daughter's thinking about joining the army," he told me. "She's 17, smart as hell, but she's worried about how she'll be treated as a woman in combat roles." "What are you going to tell her?" I asked. Rodriguez smiled. "I'm going to tell her about you. About what real leadership looks like, regardless of gender. About how the best soldier I ever served with happened to be a woman who could outshoot, outthink, and outperform anyone in the battalion." The comment hit me harder than I'd expected. For 20 years, I'd carried the weight of that mission alone, unable to share the details with family or friends, unable to explain why those 48 hours had changed everything about how I understood my own capabilities. Now I was surrounded by men who not only understood, but were actively working to ensure that the story didn't die with our generation. They were talking to their children about female soldiers, sharing tactical lessons learned from my mission, incorporating urban warfare strategies I'd developed into their own training programs. "You know what the real victory was?" Martinez said as we were saying our goodbyes. "Not just that we all made it home, but that we proved something about what American soldiers can accomplish when they're led by someone who understands both tactics and sacrifice." Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my military service. Not because of official recognition or family approval, but because the people whose opinions mattered most, soldiers who'd shared the experience, understood exactly what I'd contributed. The girl who'd joined the army to impress her father had evolved into a woman who no longer needed external validation to understand her own worth. The recognition I'd craved for decades had finally come, not from the person I'd most wanted it from, but from the people best qualified to provide it. The final Veterans Day dinner came 11 months after the first one, at the same VFW hall where everything had started. I almost didn't go, but something drew me back. Not nostalgia or hope for reconciliation, but a kind of closure that felt necessary. The room looked identical to the previous year, but the dynamic was completely different. Veterans I'd met at the 2nd Battalion reunion were there, along with younger soldiers who'd heard about my consulting work with special operations units. Word had spread through military networks about the Widowmaker of Fallujah, and I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss tactical innovations and urban warfare strategies. Dad was there too, standing near the bar with Tommy and a few other veterans from his era. But the easy camaraderie from previous years was gone, replaced by polite conversation that felt forced and uncomfortable. Tommy's respect for him had never recovered from witnessing his cruelty, and other veterans had heard enough stories to question his character. The most significant change was how younger service members approached me. These weren't men seeking war stories or trying to bask in reflected glory. They were professionals looking for practical advice from someone who'd proven herself under extreme conditions. "Ma'am, I'm deploying to Syria next month," a young lieutenant told me. "My unit's been studying the tactics you developed for urban overwatch positions. Could you walk me through the decision-making process for target prioritization?" These conversations energized me in ways that family recognition never had. Technical discussions about military methodology, philosophical questions about leadership under pressure, practical advice that could save lives in real combat situations. This was why I'd stayed in the service, why I'd requested the training command position after Fallujah. Tommy found me during a break between presentations. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his concern genuine. "Better than expected," I said honestly. "This feels right. Teaching, consulting, passing on what I learned. It's where I belong." Tommy nodded approvingly. "Your father's been asking about you, wondering if you'd be willing to talk." I glanced across the room to where Dad was standing alone, no longer the center of attention he'd once been. Age had caught up with him over the past year, but more than that, his diminished status in the veteran community had taken its toll. Without borrowed glory from Tommy's achievements or dismissive comments about my service, he'd been forced to stand on his own limited military record. "I don't think we have anything left to say to each other," I said quietly. "Maybe not," Tommy agreed. "But I wanted you to know that he's been struggling with what happened. He knows he crossed a line." The information felt irrelevant. Dad's belated recognition of his mistakes couldn't undo 20 years of dismissal and humiliation. Some damage was permanent, some relationships couldn't be repaired through awkward apologies and guilt-driven overtures. As the evening progressed, I found myself at the center of conversations I'd always wanted to be part of. Veterans from different eras were asking about modern warfare tactics, younger soldiers were seeking advice about career development, and military contractors were discussing consulting opportunities. Samantha called out Master Sergeant Thompson, an old-timer who'd served in Vietnam. "Tell these young bucks about maintaining position under fire. They think technology's replaced good old-fashioned discipline." The invitation to speak felt natural, earned through experience rather than inherited through family connections. I talked about the psychological challenges of urban warfare, about making tactical decisions with incomplete information, about the importance of staying calm when everything around you is falling apart. The technology helps, I concluded, but it can't replace judgment. It can't replace the ability to think clearly when people are depending on you for their lives. The discussion that followed was exactly what I'd been hoping for throughout my career. Professional soldiers talking about professional challenges, sharing experiences and insights that could make real differences in future operations. No ego, no competition, just people trying to get better at an impossibly difficult job. Dad tried to join the conversation during a lull, offering his perspective on convoy security from the Gulf War. The group listened politely, but it was clear that his experiences didn't translate to modern combat operations. The warfare he'd experienced was important, but fundamentally different from what current soldiers faced. "Things have certainly changed since my day," he said, trying to find common ground. "Yes, sir, they have," replied Lieutenant Morrison, one of the young officers who'd been asking about urban tactics. "That's why we're so grateful to have someone like Sergeant Barrett to learn from. Combat operations today require a completely different skill set." The comment wasn't intended as a slight, but it highlighted the generational gap that Dad had never acknowledged. His dismissal of modern military operations had been based on ignorance rather than informed comparison. The real warfare he'd held up as the standard was actually less complex, less demanding, than what current soldiers faced. As the evening wound down, younger veterans gravitated toward me for final questions and contact information. They were building networks, establishing mentorship relationships, treating me as a resource for professional development. The respect felt earned rather than inherited, based on demonstrated competence rather than borrowed glory. "Thank you for sharing your experience with us," Captain Davis told me as people were beginning to leave. "My unit's been implementing some of your Overwatch strategies, and they're already making a difference in training scenarios." This was legacy in its purest form. Not stories told at family gatherings or recognition from people who'd never served, but practical knowledge passed on to soldiers who might need it in life-or-death situations. Young men and women going into harm's way, better prepared because of lessons learned in Fallujah 20 years earlier. Dad approached me as I was gathering my things to leave. For a moment, I thought he might try one final time to bridge the gap between us, to find some way to acknowledge what I'd become. Instead, he said, "I suppose you're happy now. Getting all the attention you always wanted." The comment revealed everything about how he understood recognition and respect. To him, it was a zero-sum game where someone else's achievement diminished his own status. He couldn't comprehend that professional respect was earned through competence and service, not taken from other people. I'm not happy or unhappy, I said calmly. I'm just doing my job. I walked past him toward the exit, where Tommy was waiting with his wife. The three of us left together, stepping out into the cool November air while Dad remained inside with the diminishing crowd of veterans who no longer sought his opinions on military matters. You handled that well, Tommy said as we reached the parking lot. Better than he deserved. The assessment felt accurate. I had handled it well, not because I'd been gracious or forgiving, but because Dad's opinion had finally become irrelevant to my sense of professional identity. His approval or disapproval couldn't change what I'd accomplished or diminish the respect I'd earned from people whose judgment actually mattered. Driving home that night, I realized that the girl who'd joined the army to make her father proud had completed a different kind of mission entirely. She'd become the kind of soldier that other soldiers looked up to, the kind of leader that young officers sought out for guidance, the kind of professional whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of military leadership. The recognition had come eventually. Not from the person she'd most wanted it from, but from the people best qualified to provide it. And in the end, that had proven to be enough. But life has a way of adding postscripts to stories you think are finished. 3 months later, I was conducting a training exercise at Fort Benning when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was shaky, older, but still carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. Is this Sergeant Samantha Barrett? Yes, sir, this is Barrett. This is Colonel Frank Morrison, retired. I commanded 2nd Battalion during Operation Iraqi Freedom. I believe you know my son, Lieutenant Morrison. The connection clicked immediately. The young officer who'd been asking about urban tactics at the Veterans Day dinner, one of the soldiers who'd been implementing strategies I'd developed based on Fallujah. His father was the battalion commander I'd never met, the man whose voice had been on the radio coordinating our extraction 20 years ago. Yes, sir, I know your son. He's a fine officer. He's been telling me about your consulting work, about the tactics you've been teaching his unit. I wanted to call personally to thank you for what you did for my men back in Fallujah. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd had about that mission. Colonel Morrison had access to classified after-action reports, detailed analyses of the tactical situation, casualty reports that showed exactly how many lives had been saved by my 48 hours on that rooftop. I've been carrying guilt about that mission for 20 years, he admitted. Sending a battalion into what became a trap, watching good men get pinned down with no clear extraction route. When the reports came in about the sniper providing overwatch, I assumed it was one of my sergeants who'd found elevated position. The mission parameters changed rapidly, I said. Nobody could have predicted the convergence of insurgent forces. Maybe not, but I should have known who was saving my men. Should have made sure you got proper recognition instead of having your record buried in classified files. Colonel Morrison's call led to others. Veterans from 2nd Battalion had been working through military networks, building support for declassifying portions of my service record. Not for publicity or personal recognition, but to ensure that tactical innovations developed during the Fallujah siege could be properly incorporated into military training programs. We're not trying to make you famous, Captain Williams explained during a conference call with Pentagon officials. We're trying to make sure that lessons learned from one of the most successful urban warfare operations in modern history don't die in classified files. The formal review process took 6 months. Military historians examined after-action reports, interviewed surviving members of 2nd Battalion, analyzed the tactical decisions that had allowed an entire unit to extract from an impossible situation with minimal casualties. What emerged was a case study in adaptive leadership and precision warfare that exceeded anything in contemporary military literature. The final report was declassified on a Tuesday morning in August. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from military journalists, defense contractors, and academic institutions. The story that had been buried for 2 decades was finally entering public discussion. Sergeant Barrett, this is Professor Chen from the War College. We'd like to invite you to present your Fallujah case study to our Advanced Tactics seminar. Ms. Barrett, I'm calling from Military Times. Could we schedule an interview about your urban warfare innovations? Samantha, this is General Mackenzie from Special Operations Command. We need to discuss expanding your consulting role." The attention was overwhelming at first, but it quickly became clear that people were interested in tactical knowledge rather than personal drama. Military professionals wanted to understand how I'd maintained position under extreme pressure, how I'd coordinated multiple support elements while engaging targets, how I'd made split-second decisions that saved lives. The most meaningful response came from younger soldiers, especially women who saw my story as proof that gender didn't determine combat effectiveness. Letters arrived from female recruits, from women in combat roles, from military families whose daughters were considering service. "My daughter's been worried about joining the army because her grandfather keeps telling her that real warfare is man's work," one mother wrote. "Your story showed her what female soldiers can accomplish when they're given the chance to prove themselves." But the response that changed everything came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing training materials in my office on base when my assistant knocked on the door. "Sergeant Barrett, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your father." Dad looked older than when I'd seen him at the Veterans Day dinner, more fragile somehow. He stood in my office doorway holding a newspaper clipping, his hands trembling slightly. "I read the article," he said without preamble. "The one in Military Times. About what you really did in Fallujah." The article had been thorough, including quotes from 2nd Battalion survivors, tactical analysis from military historians, and detailed descriptions of the 48-hour siege. It was the first time the full scope of my service had been documented in public, the first time anyone outside classified circles could understand what had actually happened. "I came to apologize," Dad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for the Veterans Day dinner, but for 20 years of not understanding who you'd become." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, but he remained standing. This wasn't a social visit or an attempt to rebuild our relationship. It was something smaller, but potentially more significant, an acknowledgement of truth. "I built my whole identity around being a soldier," he said slowly. "When you joined up, I was proud but also threatened. Your success made my own service look smaller by comparison." The admission hung between us, raw and uncomfortable. Dad had finally articulated what I'd suspected for years, that his dismissal of my achievements had been rooted in his own insecurities rather than genuine concern about military standards. "The night at the VFW, when I called you a girl playing soldier." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I knew Tommy would recognize you if he looked closely enough. Part of me wanted him to, wanted someone to tell me I was wrong about what you'd accomplished. But you weren't ready to hear it," I said quietly. "No, I wasn't. And by the time I was ready, I'd already shown everyone in that room what kind of father I really was." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 2 decades of missed opportunities settling between us. This wasn't reconciliation or forgiveness. It was simply recognition of damage that couldn't be undone, relationships that couldn't be repaired through late admissions of guilt. "I'm proud of you," Dad said finally. "I should have said that 20 years ago, should have meant it when I said it. But I'm saying it now, for whatever that's worth." "Thank you," I replied, and found that I meant it. Not because his approval still mattered, but because his acknowledgement felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been carrying for too long. Dad left without trying to extend the conversation, without asking for forgiveness or attempting to rebuild our relationship. He'd come to deliver a message, to acknowledge a truth he'd spent decades avoiding, and he'd done what he came to do. After he left, I returned to reviewing training materials, but my mind kept drifting to the conversation. The girl who'd joined the army to make her father proud had finally heard the words she'd craved for 20 years. But they'd come too late to change anything fundamental about who she'd become. She was no longer the daughter seeking validation. She was the widowmaker of Fallujah, the consultant training special operations units, the soldier whose tactics were being studied at military academies around the world. Recognition from other professionals had replaced the need for family approval, and Dad's belated acknowledgement felt more like closure than vindication. That evening, I called Tommy to tell him about Dad's visit. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Relieved, I think. Like a chapter that's been open for 20 years finally got finished." "Good," Tommy said. "Some stories need proper endings, even when they come later than we'd hoped." The recognition had come eventually. First from the people whose opinions mattered most professionally, then from the broader military community, and finally from the person whose approval I'd sought longest and needed least. Each acknowledgement had served its purpose, but only the first had actually mattered. The girl who'd joined the army to make her father proud had completed her mission after all. Just not in the way she'd originally planned. Thanks for sticking with me. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a nudge to set boundaries. Drop a comment, I read them. Questions for you. Have you ever been dismissed by family in public? How did you respond in the moment? What boundary did you set afterward, and did it change anything? If an apology came years late, would you accept it or keep your distance? Veterans watching, what does real respect look like in your community? What's one achievement you've kept quiet to avoid conflict, and is it time to claim it?